I've always believed in the paranormal, in heaven and hell, in ghosts, demons, angels, the idea that there's something beyond what we can see. But I also believe in real evil, the kind that doesn't come from the underworld, but from the human mind, the kind that hides behind a smile or a story. Ed and Lorraine Warren, those are names you probably know from the Conjuring series, a franchise that I'll admit are solid watches. And you want so badly to believe that the stories they tell are real, that the hauntings happened exactly the way they said they did. Amityville was supposed to be a haunting, a house cursed by murder, a family terrorized by something in the walls. Brookfield was supposed to prove possession, a man claiming the devil made him kill. But underneath the headlines in the holy water lies something far more complicated. It's about belief, obsession, and how far people will go to prove that evil exists, even if they have to invent it. Welcome back to Darkly Speaking. My name is Alex Kern, and tonight we're stepping inside two of the most infamous cases in American paranormal history, stories that changed the way we think about hauntings, faith, and what it really means to face evil. Because the truth is, the devil doesn't always come with horns and smoke. Sometimes he wears a human face, and when you look at stories like Amityville and Brookfield, you have to ask yourself, did the devil actually make them do it? Or did something far darker and far more human take hold first? In the American courtroom, truth is sworn on the Bible. But what happens when the devil becomes part of the testimony? Two homes, two crimes, two stories that would blur the line between faith and fear, between justice and belief. One sits quiet on Ocean Avenue in Amityville, New York. The other, a modest home in Brookfield, Connecticut. Both would become symbols of supernatural evil, and both would pull the same names into the story. Ed and Lorraine Warren. In 1974, the DeFeo family was murdered inside of their Amityville home. A year later, the Lutz family moved in and, within weeks, fled, claiming something dark still lived there. When the Warrens arrived, they documented what they believed to be demonic forces, a haunting unlike any other. 7 years later, another case would put them under an even brighter spotlight. Arne Johnson, a young man from Brookfield, murdered his landlord and claimed he was possessed when it happened. It would become the first time in U.S. history that "the devil made me do it" was used as a legal defense. And once again, the Warrens were there, as witnesses, as believers, as storytellers. Both stories would become national obsessions, private tragedies transformed into public spectacles. And at the center stood Ed and Lorraine Warren, the self-proclaimed bridge between faith and the unknown. Their investigations would go on to inspire what we now know as the Conjuring Universe, a cinematic world built from their files, their faith, and their fear. But while the films make for good horror, the real stories are far more complicated, because I absolutely believe in the paranormal and what can't be explained. But I also believe that evil can exist in human form, and I'd like to think I believe in the justice system. Or at least I want to. And that's where the Warren files start to raise uncomfortable questions. The ethical dilemmas hidden behind the evidence, the act of owning other people's tragedies, of turning grief and death into stories for money and fame. Did their work document the truth, or did it create its own version of it? That's what makes these cases so unsettling. They live in the space where faith, fear, and justice collide. When belief becomes evidence, when evil becomes a defense, where does accountability and faith begin? Can a claim of possession absolve a crime, or can the supernatural stand trial alongside the living? These aren't just legal questions, they're moral ones, and they challenge the very foundation of how we define truth, justice, and belief. When the supernatural enters the courtroom, who's really on trial? The accused, the investigators, or our own willingness to believe? To understand how belief found its way into a courtroom, we have to go back to where it all began. In a house on Ocean Avenue. November 13th, 1974, a cold Wednesday night in Amityville, New York, a small town nestled in Long Island, just about 30 miles outside of New York City. It was the kind of night where the air carries a damp chill and the streetlights cast a muted gold across the empty sidewalks. Ocean Avenue is still. The canal behind the homes glimmers faintly, reflecting porch lights and the bare branches of late autumn trees. At the corner stands a white Dutch colonial with black shutters and a small wooden sign that reads, High Hopes, the DeFeo house. Perfectly kept, symmetrical, and quiet. The kind of place you wouldn't look at twice. At Henry's bar, a few blocks away, conversation hums beneath the sound of clinking glasses, when all of a sudden, the door swings open. 23-year-old Ronald Butch DeFeo Jr. stumbles in, face pale, eyes wide, breath ragged. You gotta help me, he says, voice shaking. My parents have been shot. The room goes silent. Butch is a familiar face and the DeFeos are well known. A few men, friends who've known him for years, jump to their feet and follow him out. They pile into his car, race through the damp streets, tires screeching against the asphalt. The headlights flash over the canal and onto the white siding of the house. Everything looks normal. Porch light glowing, curtains drawn. But when they pull into the driveway, Butch stays behind in the car while his friends rush to the door. The air inside is still, thick, and heavy with the faint scent of gunpowder and something metallic. They call out for the family, but no one answers. The group climbs the stairs, hearts pounding, flashlights trembling in their hands. One by one, they open the bedroom doors and find the unthinkable. They find 4 of the DeFeo children, Dawn, 18, Allison, 13, Mark, 12, and John Matthew, 7, lying face down in their beds, each shot once, still in their nightclothes and the sheets pulled loosely over them as if they'd never even woken up. One of Ronnie's friends, Joe Yeswit, runs for the phone, hands shaking as he dials 911. Everyone in the house is dead, he says. On the other end, only stunned silence. Minutes later, patrol cars flood the street. Red and blue light washes over the quiet homes. Inside, officers move slowly through the house, flashlights cutting through the dark. In the master bedroom, they find Ronald Sr. and Luis, both shot twice. 6 victims, no struggle, no forced entry, and no one, not even the neighbors, heard the gunfire from a rifle without a silencer. The silence becomes its own kind of horror, and by dawn, the house glows beneath the harsh glare of police spotlights, its windows reflecting chaos while giving nothing back. Reporters gather on the lawn. A quiet Long Island street turns into a crime scene, and Butch is led away for his own protection. You see, he claims it was a mob hit, a man named Lou Fellini. But detectives found no proof of any organized crime. But they do find a box in Ronnie's room, a box that holds a .35 caliber Marlin gun, the exact kind of gun that killed the DeFeo family. By morning, his story begins to unravel. After hours of questioning, Butch slumps forward, voice faint. He says, "It all started so fast. Once I started, I just couldn't stop. It went so fast." When asked why, he hesitates. "The voices from the house told me to do it." The detectives exchange uneasy looks. The words hang in the air, a thread that will pull the story somewhere no one expects. That night, the house stands dark again. Police tape flutters in the cold wind. The canal glimmers behind it. Neighbors close their blinds and keep their lights on. By sunrise, Amityville had a killer, 6 victims, and a question no one could answer. What could drive a man to destroy his own family? In time, the world would be offered an explanation, one that didn't come from the courtroom, but from inside the house itself. 1 year after the DeFeo murders, 112 Avenue stood empty, its windows shuttered, the grass overgrown, a house that looked more forgotten than cursed. Everyone in Long Island knew what had happened there, and the whispers hadn't stopped, about the voices Ronnie DeFeo claimed had told him to kill his own family, about the evil some believed still lingered within those walls. People said the murders were too clean, too silent, that no one could sleep through that kind of violence without something else at work. To many, it was proof that the house itself was cursed. Then, in December of 1975, George and Kathy Lutz bought the white Dutch colonial home, complete with a boathouse, swimming pool, and 5 bedrooms for $80,000, a fraction of its value. Though well above their budget, it felt like a dream for George, Kathy, and her 3 children from a previous marriage, 9-year-old Daniel, 7-year-old Christopher, and 5-year-old Melissa. They knew what had happened there, but something about the house, they said, felt calm, peaceful, almost like a chance to start over. Except what they didn't realize was that they were stepping into something that they couldn't explain. It was a bitterly cold winter. The canal behind the house was frozen and the neighborhood was quiet, almost unnaturally so. Boxes still lined the floor, the kids' laughter echoing faintly through the halls. For a brief moment, it was just another family settling in. But that peace didn't last. The first night, George woke at 3:15 a.m. to the sound of tapping outside. The family dog barked toward the boathouse, and when George went to check, he thought he saw movement near the water. But it was just the boathouse doors swaying in the wind. From that night on, he woke again at exactly 3:15 every morning. No sound, no reason, just the same unease creeping through the house. George later claimed that he believed that 3:15 a.m. was the approximate time of the DeFeo murders. Cold air pooled in corners no matter how high they turned the thermostat. A heavy ceramic lion statue began moving on its own, sometimes just a few inches, sometimes across the entire room. One night, as George and Kathy sat by the fireplace, Kathy swore she saw a shape form in the smoke, something demonic-looking with horns, watching. They even claimed to see green slime oozing from the walls and the keyholes. Even the children began to change. Kathy sometimes caught Melissa whispering to someone unseen, pausing as if listening to a reply. Then, on Christmas Day, Melissa announced she had a new imaginary friend named Jody, a pig with red glowing eyes who she said lived by the boathouse. Days later, Kathy looked out the window and screamed. In the snow near the canal stood a large pig-shaped figure with red eyes staring back. When George ran outside, there was nothing there. Upstairs, the playroom would fill with flies, dozens of them, buzzing against the windows and the walls in the middle of winter. Daniel, their eldest, began swatting at them in frustration. But when Kathy came to look, the dead flies were gone. The tension inside the house grew heavier each day. One afternoon, Kathy felt a crushing pressure around her chest, like invisible hands squeezing her. A few days later, the family attended a wedding, but when George entered the church, he grew pale and dizzy. As he reached for the holy water, he nearly collapsed. By mid-January, the house reeked of foul odors that drifted through the vents. Trying to air it out, Daniel ran upstairs to open a window in the playroom. And just as he reached for the latch, the window slammed shut on his fingers. At that point, the Lutzes no longer believed they were dealing with stress or coincidence. Whatever lived in that house wanted them gone. January 14th, 1976, their 28th night in the house. The furnace had gone out again. George and Kathy were in bed, with 5-year-old Melissa shivering beneath the blankets. Around 1 a.m., Kathy suddenly sat up, slid out of bed, and stood motionless in front of the mirror. George called to her, tried to wake her up, but she didn't respond. He said she looked distant, entranced. When he finally shook her, she collapsed back into the bed. Moments later, the house erupted. Furniture shifted, voices whispered his name. Something unseen and cold slipped into bed beside them. George claimed he blacked out from fear. When he came to, the boys were crying, saying there was a monster in their room, the dog growling at the staircase. George looked toward the stairs and froze. A dark figure stood at the top, unmoving. That was the breaking point. George grabbed his family and they ran into the freezing night, leaving everything behind. Within days, the story hit the press and America was hooked. Evil had an address. By March of 1976, Ed and Lorraine Warren arrived at 112 Ocean Avenue with a televised crew to conduct a seance that would later air on national TV. Cameras captured them praying in the darkened house, calling out to whatever still lingered. Lorraine, visibly shaken, described the presence she felt as overwhelming. Later saying, quote, "I hope this is as close to hell as I'll ever get," end quote. From that night came one of the most recognizable images in paranormal history, the ghostly figure of a small boy peering from a doorway eerily resembling one of the murdered DeFeo children. When the seance aired as part of a national news special, it became a cultural flashpoint. Interviews, reenactments, and debates dominated television screens. Watching the coverage, George and Kathy Lutz realized their story had grown far beyond them. Their haunting was no longer just a personal tragedy, it had become a national spectacle. Not long after, the Lutzes met with Butch DeFeo's defense attorney to discuss a potential book deal. In the fall of 1977, Jay Anson's The Amityville Horror hit shelves and the legend was sealed. But behind the spectacle, questions began to surface. The Warrens' seance had not only elevated the Lutz's claims, but also tied the story back to the DeFeo murders, turning a family's suffering into something far more profitable. The line between faith and fiction was blurring, and those who had once documented the devil were now part of the story themselves. Because behind the headlines, another story was taking shape, one that had less to do with demons and more to do with the people who claimed to fight them. A story that would soon lead back to the DeFeo case and forward to Brookfield, Connecticut, where, for the first time in U.S. history, a man would claim the devil made him kill. Amityville changed everything. Before that, Ed and Lorraine Warren were known only to a small network of church groups and New England families who had heard rumors of their ghost investigations. They met as teenagers in Bridgeport, Connecticut during the early 1940s. Ed, a Navy veteran and self-taught demonologist, claimed his fascination with evil began after growing up in a haunted home. Lorraine, a self-described clairvoyant and light trance medium, said she could sense energy and see auras around people. Together, they built a partnership, grounded in faith and curiosity, a husband and wife team who claimed to bridge the gap between religion and the supernatural. They began traveling across New England, visiting homes said to be haunted, sketching the properties, and documenting evidence as spirits. Ed handled the logistics and theology. Lorraine focused on empathy and spiritual discernment. They offered prayers, blessings, and guidance to frightened families, and before long, their reputation spread. Newspaper articles began calling them ghost hunters, a title they eagerly embraced. But within religious and academic circles, not everyone was convinced. Some saw them as devoted missionaries, while others saw them as opportunists, storytellers, skilled at turning belief into spectacle. Then came Amityville. Overnight, they went from local investigators to national icons, the couple who faced down the devil. Talk shows, television specials, and lecture tours followed, all built around one message: evil is real and we've seen it. They became the faces of faith under fire, reassuring believers that the battle between good and evil wasn't metaphorical. But behind that conviction was something harder to define, a pattern where faith, fear, and performance began to intertwine. To understand how that pattern took hold, we have to go back, before the hauntings, before the headlines, and to the truth of what really happened inside the DeFeo home. Ronald Butch DeFeo Jr. wasn't possessed. He was a 23-year-old man addicted to heroin, LSD, and speed, living under a roof he and others defined by abuse and control. His temper was volatile, his relationship with his father, violent. He'd threatened him with a rifle before, had been expelled from school due to bad behavior, and was already on probation for theft. Psychiatrists later diagnosed him with antisocial personality disorder. So when the case went to trial in 1975, the defense argued insanity, that DeFeo had been driven mad by a satanic presence in the house that urged him to do it, urged by demonic voices, evil voices, the devil. His attorney, William Weber, argued that DeFeo was unaware of his actions, his mind clouded by evil voices in the house and years of drug abuse that left him detached from reality. The prosecution countered that DeFeo acted deliberately, fueled by anger toward his parents and a desire for their life insurance money. They emphasized the methodical nature of the crime, 6 shots fired from a .35 Marlin rifle, as each family member slept, all face down, none showing signs of a struggle. In the end, the jury sided with the prosecution. DeFeo was convicted of 6 counts of second-degree murder and sentenced to 6 concurrent life terms at Greenhaven Correctional Facility. Not long after, DeFeo began claiming that his sister Dawn had helped him carry out the murders before he turned the gun on her, though no credible evidence ever supported that accusation. The claim, along with lingering questions about how 6 people could be killed in their beds without anyone waking in a 3-story home, kept the case alive in public fascination. That debate deepened decades later when LA filmmaker Ryan Katzenbach released a 2012 documentary suggesting that more than one firearm may have been used, raising new doubts about the official version of events and reigniting speculation that someone else could have been inside the home that night. After his conviction, DeFeo cycled through versions of the truth, first blaming a mob hit, then claiming he'd heard voices, before finally insisting that he was overtaken by a demonic force. It was that last version that caught the Warrens' attention, Possession fit perfectly with their theology. Evil had a vessel, and now it had a stage. Amityville became an engine. The Lutz's collaboration with DeFeo's defense attorney initially aimed to turn their story into a book, but the deal fell through when they couldn't agree on how to split the profits. The Lutzes then took their story to writer Jay Anson, who published The Amityville Horror in 1977, a bestseller that inspired multiple film adaptations spanning decades. William Weber later admitted the haunting narrative was born over a bottle of wine, mixing real details from the murders with fiction designed to sell. The neighbor's cat, for example, became the red-eyed pig. A spilled dinner became dripping slime. In 1988, Weber claimed that he and the Lutzes, quote, took real-life incidents and transposed them. In other words, it was a hoax, end quote. Anson, who had previously made a short documentary on The Exorcist, drew from more than 35 hours of taped interviews with the Lutzes to craft the book. Critics like sociologist Robert Bartholomew later described him as, quote, a writer who knew how to make belief profitable, end quote, arguing that the Lutzes' financial troubles may have fueled the tale. Anson admitted that he didn't know whether the story was true, only that the Lutzes believed it was. The Warrens' involvement gave the account an air of legitimacy. Although the church quietly distanced itself and investigators found no evidence of the paranormal, the story still thrived. Lawsuits followed between the Lutzes, publishers, and filmmakers over who owned the rights to the haunting. Somewhere along the way, the truth collapsed into legend. Addiction, violence, and trauma were rewritten as something marketable, a demonic morality tale that sold better than the reality of dysfunction. If the devil sells better than dysfunction, which story do we choose to believe? For the Warrens, that question rarely seemed to matter. They saw their work as a divine mission, proof that faith could confront darkness. But their evidence, the photos, tapes, and interviews, fed Hollywood as much as it served the church. Ed was the voice of certainty, confident, commanding, unflinching. Lorraine was the soul of belief, warm, intuitive, deeply empathetic. Together, they blurred the line between testimony and theater, turning the unexplained into something consumable. They didn't just investigate evil, they branded it. Because Amityville wasn't proof of the devil. It was proof of our need to make sense of chaos, to believe that tragedy has a purpose, that evil can be named and fought. The Warrens gave fear a shape, and in doing so, made it easier to live with. After Amityville, the Warrens didn't just investigate hauntings, they began influencing verdicts. This time, their belief in the devil wouldn't just haunt a home, it would enter a courtroom. And if Amityville was the story that made the world believe in evil, Brookfield would be the place where someone used it as a defense. It was February 16th, 1981, an unremarkable winter day in Brookfield, Connecticut, a small working-class town where nothing like this had ever happened before. Snow melted into gray slush along the curbs, dogs barked in the backyards, neighbors waved across driveways. And above a modest dog kennel on Federal Road, Alan Bono sat in his small apartment, unaware that by nightfall, he would be dead. 19-year-old Arne Johnson had taken the day off work to spend time with his girlfriend, Debbie Glatzel, and her employer, Alan Bono, the kennel's manager and their landlord. Along with a few friends, the group went out for lunch at a nearby restaurant, sharing food and a few too many drinks. By the time they returned to the kennel, Bono's mood had shifted. He grew argumentative, his voice slurred, his focus locked on Debbie's 9-year-old cousin, Mary, who was spending the afternoon with them. Witnesses recalled Bono grabbing Mary and refusing to let her go. Arne stepped forward, demanding he release her, his voice low. He even started growling, actually growling like an animal. What happened next unfolded in seconds. Arne pulled out a 5-inch pocket knife and stabbed Bono repeatedly in the chest and abdomen. 4 or 5 powerful fatal blows is what it took for Bono to stagger outside and collapse near the office, bleeding heavily. Arne stood frozen, face pale, eyes vacant, before quietly walking down the road as Debbie screamed for help. Paramedics rushed to the scene, but Bono died several hours later at the hospital. It was the first recorded murder in Brookfield's 193-year history and the first in 3 decades of police records. Police found Arne about 2 miles away, wandering aimlessly, dazed and silent. When questioned, he said he couldn't remember the attack, only that something had taken over. Debbie told investigators that he wasn't himself. By the next morning, newspapers were already calling it the Brookfield Demon Murder. And Lorraine Warren was telling reporters it was the devil's work. It wouldn't be long before the story that started with a murder would unravel backward into claims of possession and a family whose terror began months earlier. In the summer of 1980, Debbie Glatzel and her fiancé Arne Johnson were settling into a small yellow cottage with green shutters just outside of Brookfield, close to Debbie's family. It was the kind of place that felt perfect for starting a life together. Quiet, cozy, surrounded by trees. Debbie's parents and brothers came by to help clear it out before the move. 11-year-old David tagged along, eager to help the newly engaged couple start their next chapter. Inside the cottage, most of the rooms were empty, except for the one at the back. The only thing left behind by the previous tenant was an old waterbed. David went in alone to start cleaning, sunlight slanting through the windows, dust floating in the still air. Then, out of the corner of his eye, he saw something move. Before he could turn, he felt a violent shove that sent him sprawling onto the waterbed. He looked up and there it was. An old man stood over him. His skin was gray and blistered, his eyes hollow and black, his expression twisted. He wore a torn flannel shirt, dark pants, and his body looked like it was covered in burns, as if he'd come straight from a fire. The figure leaned close, the air thick with the smell of decay, and hissed that David would die if his family stayed in that house. David bolted from the room, sobbing, and ran straight to his sister. He told Debbie what had happened, that something evil was in the house and she couldn't move in. She tried to calm him, assuming he'd just imagined it. But the next time he saw the figure, it was even worse. The old man's skin blackened and peeling, his eyes burning with hatred. That was when David knew, whatever this thing was, it was evil, and it terrified him. From that day forward, even though David refused to set foot in that cottage again, the nightmares came for him anyway. Vivid, suffocating dreams that made it feel as if the thing he'd seen had followed him home. He would wake in the middle of the night, screaming, claiming the old man was at his bedside. The family started finding bruises and scratches on him that no one could explain. Soon, he was speaking in strange voices, muttering words in Latin, reciting Bible passages backward. His parents took turns sitting up through the night, terrified to leave him alone. He would curse, kick, and spit, shouting words that no child should know. It was the moment the family realized how far things had spiraled. The family began taking shifts to stay awake while David slept, fearful of what he might do or of what might come through him if they didn't. As the days passed, David's behavior grew more erratic. He claimed the old man threatened to take his soul and that more voices were now speaking to him. Dozens of them. The Glatzels, devout Catholics, turned to the church for help. Priests visited to bless the home, but the activity only escalated. Growls in the walls, sudden gusts of cold air, heavy footsteps when no one was there. The church authorized an investigation. That's when Ed and Lorraine Warren entered the picture. When the Warrens arrived, they said what had taken hold of David was far more than one presence. During one of the early interviews with the family, Lorraine later claimed that she saw a thick black mist form beside David, curling and twisting like smoke before vanishing into thin air. Lorraine later said she saw faint red marks forming around David's neck as he gasped for air, insisting he felt unseen hands tightening around his throat. According to their notes and recordings, the Warrens claimed it wasn't just one demon tormenting David, but 41 of them. They said each spirit clawed for dominance inside him, fighting for control, a chaos of voices that left him convulsing, whispering, and screaming all at once. Despite this belief, the church would not approve of an exorcism for David. Instead, several priests joined the Warrens through a series of prayers and blessing for the house. Ed kept his recorder running, documenting every second, while Lorraine described a presence that seemed to feed on David's fear and wanted his soul. During one of these prayer sessions, Arne stayed close, helpless as David's body twisted and thrashed. In a moment of desperation, he knelt beside him, calling out to whatever was tormenting the child, offering himself instead. That moment, the Warrens would later say, opened a door that could never truly be closed. According to the Warrens and Debbie, that was the moment everything changed. Over the next few months, David grew calmer, but Arne began to unravel. Months after the final incident with David, Arne's behavior grew darker. One day, Debbie and Arne went back to their old house and he just stood by the window, motionless and growling like an animal. On another occasion, Arne went to mass with Debbie and her family, and in the middle of the mass, he suddenly stands up, swears, and says he wants to get out of there. Another time, Debbie claimed to have heard Arne shout out in two different voices, one being his own and the other being far more sinister. This happened on the very same day Arne murdered Alan Bono. But when the case finally reached the court, faith met evidence and evidence won. Attorney Martin Manila was initially hesitant to take the case because of the unprecedented nature of the defense. He began researching similar cases in the United Kingdom, where courts had twice considered possession as a mitigating factor. In one case, an arson suspect was acquitted after claiming demonic possession. In another, an accused rapist's sentence was reduced. After learning about those two outcomes, Manila decided to speak with the Warrens, and only then did he officially file the plea, not guilty by reason of demonic possession. It would become the first and only time such a defense was attempted in the United States. Ed and Lorraine Warren supplied audio recordings from David Glatzel's alleged investigation and possession incidents, claiming Arne had inherited the same entity. The Warrens claimed that demonic possession meant the person was no longer in control, and therefore, Arne was not responsible for the murder. The judge, however, refused to hear Manila's argument at all, ruling the plea legally invalid as a defense. This decision set a clear precedent in the United States. Demonic possession could not be used as a defense. The prosecution argued Arne acted out of rage and intoxication. Witnesses from the cafe, where he and Alan Bono had lunch, testified that both men were drinking pretty heavily. A paramedic also later recalled hearing Debbie on the phone with her father saying something to the effect of, "Oh, Daddy, he didn't mean to do it. You know how he gets when he drinks." Prosecutors framed the act as a violent outburst, not a supernatural episode. Despite the Warrens' insistence that multiple exorcism requests had taken place, the church officials clarified that no formal rite was ever authorized or performed, only informal blessings. No priest could testify. No evidence could substantiate possession. The jury rejected the supernatural claim. Arne Johnson was convicted of first-degree manslaughter and sentenced to 10 to 20 years. He served 5, married Debbie while still in prison, and was released quietly, never reoffending. But the story didn't end there. In 2007, Debbie's brother Carl Glatzel Jr. sued the Warrens, claiming the devil in Connecticut was fabricated for money and fame. He insisted David was never possessed, only suffering ill-induced hallucinations, and that the publicity around the hoax destroyed their childhood. In Brookfield, the devil never took the stand. What did was belief, and belief lost. But as Arne served his sentence, the couple who'd built their careers on fighting darkness found new ways to keep it alive. The Warrens' story didn't end with their investigations. It evolved into something far more complex and far darker. Ed Warren died in 2006. Lorraine became the guardian of their legacy, appearing in documentaries, giving interviews, consulting on the Conjuring franchise. She presented herself as the keeper of proof that good and evil exist. But the more she spoke, the more people began to look deeper. What they found was a story that blurred the line between devotion and deception. In 2017, a woman named Judith Penny came forward. For decades, she'd been known only as the quiet caretaker of the Warrens Occult Museum, the woman who cataloged haunted relics and locked away cursed dolls. But Judith said she wasn't just an employee. Her connection to the Warrens began when she was just 15 years old. Ed Warren was 37 at the time, working as a delivery driver, making stops near Judith's high school. Over time, he began visiting her and eventually inviting her into his home. In 1963, the Warrens built a small apartment above their house in Connecticut for Judith. Their daughter later confirmed she lived there for years. According to Judith, Ed alternated nights between her and Lorraine. That same year, local police received a tip. A teenage girl was living with a married man. You see, Connecticut's law at the time prohibited an unmarried woman to live with a married man. Judith was questioned and briefly detained, but refused to sign a statement admitting to an affair. She later said Lorraine knew everything and chose to protect the family's public image. In 1978, as the Warrens' fame exploded after Amityville, Judith became pregnant with Ed's child. She claimed Lorraine forced her to end the pregnancy to avoid scandal and concocted a cover story. Judith described being pressured into an abortion and was told to tell others she'd been assaulted by a stranger. It was a secret she carried for 40 years. Ed never addressed the allegations. He died before they surfaced. Lorraine never mentioned Judith publicly, but became increasingly protective over their reputation. When filmmakers began developing the Conjuring films, Lorraine signed on as a consultant, enforcing strict moral clauses. Neither she nor Ed could be depicted as unethical, unfaithful, or criminal in any way. A very specific and unusual set of clauses embedded in her contracts that led to even more suspicion surrounding Ed and Lorraine's real relationship. The movies turned them into saints of the supernatural, a sanitized myth built on omissions. They were seen as loving, supportive, and faithful partners. After Lorraine's death in 2019, scrutiny intensified. Former acquaintances confirmed Judith's long presence in the Warren home. Journalists uncovered inconsistencies in timelines, evidence, and supposed case files. Some claimed entire investigations were exaggerated or even fabricated to sustain their fame. To some, the Warrens were pioneers of faith-based paranormal research. To others, they were opportunists who turned other people's pain into profit. A reputation even Judith Penny echoed years later, saying of Lorraine, quote, "Her real god is money," end quote. The truth, as always, sits somewhere in the dark between. The Warrens built a legacy on faith, love, and the battle between light and dark, but the closer you look, the harder it becomes to tell which side they were really on. Behind every haunting they investigated were real people, frightened, grieving, desperate for meaning, and behind the stories they sold were the parts they never told. I don't think the devil had a part to play in either of the stories I talked about today, but I do think evil exists, just not in the way people wanted to believe. It lived in Ronnie DeFeo, in Arne Johnson, and in the Warrens too. The moral and ethical dilemmas behind profiting off of desperate and even mentally ill people is sickening, because even more terrifying than a haunted house is watching people turn real pain, real trauma, and real mental illness into a paycheck. Maybe they started out with good intentions, wanting to help, wanting to prove something bigger than all of us, but somewhere along the way, that purpose turned into profit. And that's the legacy that lingers. Because the most dangerous kind of evil isn't always supernatural. It's human. It's ambition disguised as faith. And it's the one thing that doesn't need an exorcism to survive. Thanks so much for joining me for this episode of Darkly Speaking. If you've had your own strange or paranormal experience, something you still can't explain, I'd love to hear it. You can send in your story to darklyspeakingpodcast@gmail.com. And if you want to keep exploring the dark and unexplained, make sure you're following along on socials at Darkly Speaking Podcast for more dark and chilling content. Leaving a quick rating or review on Spotify or Apple Podcasts really helps these stories reach new listeners who are just as curious about the dark and unexplained. Thank you so much for listening, and I'll see you next time with a brand new episode.